Well, many of you know me from my involvement with PCORI or Q, and I'm also the executive director of LymeDisease.org. Kay Dickerson asked me if I would talk today about the role that intellectual conflicts of interest play in Lyme disease and how they affect consumer engagement. And actually, there's a Q story here about Lyme guidelines that we'll get to a little bit later. So I'm going to give you a little bit of background about Lyme disease, but not a lot, just enough so you know the context. Chronic Lyme disease is one of the most controversial diseases in the United States. The state of the science in Lyme disease is limited, emerging, and conflicting. There are two research and medical paradigms for the disease, and there is a highly polemic debate over the paradigms. However, the paradigm of the Infectious Diseases Society of America, or IDSA, is the dominant paradigm, followed by many insurers, hospitals, and even medical boards. The IDSA guidelines strongly recommend against additional treatment for patients who remain ill after their short-term course of antibiotics, and access to care is a social justice issue for the community. For the past 11 years, the IDSA has refused to include patients and others on their guideline panels. There have been protests throughout the United States, congressional hearings, petitions, state legislative efforts to provide treatment options, and even a state antitrust investigation for abuse of power. There's a lot of uncertainty surrounding Lyme disease, a lack of patient voice, and a lot of polemic viewpoints, which brings us to the issue of intellectual conflicts of interest. So we all know that there are financial conflicts of interest and how conflicted panel members can expand the market for a drug with a stroke of a pen. But there is a growing awareness of intellectual bias among professional affiliations and medical specialties bias as well, where societies may take competing stances on treatment issues as they have in Lyme disease. There can also be researchers who are wed to a particular viewpoint, perhaps one supported by their research paradigm. Think of guidelines written by researchers who cite their own work over the contradictory work of their peers. A strong attachment to a specific point of view creates bias and undermines impartiality. What we're really talking about is how issues are framed. When someone has a preconceived viewpoint, everything may flow from it. What questions are asked? What studies are included? What outcomes are deemed important? How results are interpreted? Strongly held intellectual viewpoints can affect evidence assessment, especially when evidence is uncertain and there's lots of room for opinion. With intellectual conflicts of interest, the temptation is to include evidence that supports your view and leave out the evidence that doesn't. Or if you're running a guidelines panel looking for unanimous consensus, simply exclude those who disagree. A good patient advocate who knows the science may ask that all relevant evidence be taken into account and that all viewpoints be represented. So we care about intellectual conflicts of interest because they introduce scientific bias. But there's another equally important reason that we care about intellectual conflicts of interest, and that's because intellectual conflicts of interest are actually matters of perspective, viewpoint, opinion, and values. For example, what constitutes good enough evidence to treat is a value judgment about the risks of acting too soon and the risks of acting too late for patients who are ill. The question is, whose perspective and viewpoint is important? How about the patient's? The bottom line is that healthcare is riddled with stakeholders who have interests and views that conflict. And as Dr. Ezekiel Emanuel points out, when others represent your interests are likely to be sacrificed to someone else's interests. Out in the Twittersville, we have people saying, I don't want a key opinion leader, I want a key fact leader. Or, if we have data, let's look at the data. If all we have are opinions, let's go with mine. So patient voice is important to represent patient interests. In 2011, the Institute of Medicine pressed patient involvement forward by saying that those affected by guidelines should have a voice, and that the patient voice should be representative and prepared. These guidelines are not binding on medical specialty societies, but they do increase the pressure enormously to include patients. So this year, in what I believe is a first of firsts, the IDSA approached Q and asked for a patient representative for their new Lyme disease guidelines panel. Q recommended me, and I believe the answer was not her and perhaps not a Lyme patient. The fear, of course, is that they want a drive-through, check-the-box token patient to fill an empty process chair and do their bidding. So what should guideline developers do when a disease is controversial and stakeholders may disagree? I've developed a short list of rules of engagement, but in the interest of time, I will highlight just a few. The patient voice should be included, authentic, representative, and empowered. Consensus should not be obtained by excluding people who disagree. Disagreement should be acknowledged and published. I welcome any comments you might have and want to thank you for your time.